Developer Tools with Maarten Balliauw.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm powering software delivery for business-critical software projects. And one of the quick announcements, not really putting it in good terms yet or formality, we're going to be posting a new software engineering apprenticeship for myself. So this will be the fourth apprentice that I've had in, I think, the last around 4 years. So that'll be announcing soon. If you're a young .NET software engineer and you'd like an opportunity to grow very, very quickly while contributing, then this may be for you. Quick announcement, my architect forums are going strong. Signups for the next session are up. And if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with peer architect leaders, then just sign up at the link in the show notes. And for those of you who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. So my guest today on the show is Maarten Balliauw. Maarten loves building web and cloud apps. His main interests are in .NET and web technologies, C# and application performance. He's a developer advocate at JetBrains, and he created SpeakerTravel, a tool to help conference organizers. He's also a frequent speaker at various national and international events, and in his free time, he brews his own beer. And I will include a link to his blog in the show notes, blog.maartenballiauw.be. Maarten, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Hey, Jeffrey, welcome, and thanks for having me. This is a fantastic opportunity to be able to speak with you and be on the podcast, so thanks.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. Thanks for being with me. Before we get into developer tools, and of course, in your position and in JetBrains, you do a lot of developer tools, but I always like to ask the guests, what are some notable things that happened in your career that were kind of transformative in you working on the things that you're working on today?
That's an interesting one. So actually, you mentioned it while introducing me that I speak at conferences and so on. And what I thought was very transformative is that I consider myself an introvert. When I just started out, my manager back then was like, okay, you have to go and speak at a user group. And I did that because I thought I could not refuse. I found that really nice to do, and I wanted more. So I started doing that. At some point, I met Hadi, my current manager here at JetBrains. And at some point, he was like, hey, do you want to come and work for JetBrains? So I think the most transformative thing is to sometimes step out of your comfort zone because it may lead you on a path that you may like.
Yes. So that's certainly true. We interviewed Jeff Fritz on the podcast, which he does so much content for Microsoft now, but I think it was back in 08 and 09. He shared that he was at a Microsoft Tech Ed talk, and that kind of just springboarded him. And it's like, I could do this. So it's so true. Just jump out.
Yeah, exactly.
So developer tools, I just want to, JetBrains, for maybe the few people who don't know about it, is big into developer tools, and I want to ask you about that. But there's so many developers out there who are building software applications and using developer tools. But what is different about the mindset when all of your programming is for the developer tools themselves and not, business applications that people are using just to do regular day-to-day non-techie work?
I find it really interesting. So before I joined JetBrains, I was big on building applications in Azure for customers and so on. And I really liked the fact that you could do things like distributed computing, have multiple servers talk to one another, and then started working at JetBrains and quite quickly realized in the code base that in the IDE, there are things like message buses. You are passing messages around. So in that regard, it's not that different. The only thing that's probably really different is that very often you are building in new technology or building tooling for new technology, which means that none of the documentation may be up to date, or there might even not be any documentation. And there's a lot of reverse engineering involved and seeing if something works or trying to figure out how it works. So it's actually quite nice in that regard. Sometimes frustrating as well, but also really nice to be able to dig into those things and see how they work.
So for the people who may just know about JetBrains in a cursory manner, can you just give us real quick, what is JetBrains and why should .NET devs care?
All right, so JetBrains is a company that has, I don't know how many right now, IDEs for all kinds of languages. So whether you're doing Java, you can use IntelliJ IDEA, which many people may know. If you're doing .NET, we have ReSharper to help you be more productive. If you're doing web, you have WebStorm. So we have all of these IDEs that essentially help developers be better at what they do by giving some hints, by making their codes a little bit easier to write, giving them assistance while writing the code, but also having all of the tools that they need. So if you're using Rider, for example, which is our .NET IDE, you can do C# development, but also VB.NET and F#, of course. But there's also really great database tools in Rider so that you don't have to look for any other tools, essentially, and you can just do everything from within one IDE. And what I really like, and one of the reasons why I joined JetBrains, is that IDE stands for Integrated Development Environments. And what I really like is that all of those things also really are integrated. So if you're doing C#, for example, and you use the database tools in Rider, you will get code completion for your tables, for your foreign keys and everything. If you're using a framework like Dapper, for example, or Entity Framework, Raw SQL, you will get completion inside of your C# strings based on what the database provider can give you.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's more than vanilla SQL Management Studio.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I've been using, at a minimum, ReSharper since, what was it? Whenever Visual Studio 1.1, .NET 1.1. Yeah, whatever version of Visual Studio that was. So it was a lot.
I think ReSharper was 2004 or something
2004,
like that.
Okay, yeah. Quite a while ago. And still to this day, when I set up a new laptop and I start using Visual Studio and wait a minute, hold on, got to get ReSharper in here. So much muscle memory is built up. So many shortcut keys just flowing around. So I've loved it. Now, I just want to cover the quick announcement from Microsoft before we move on. They kind of announced that Visual Studio for Mac is going to drop off support, sometime mid to 2024. Now, you guys provide Rider for development for Mac. So how did that announcement, what did it change? What were the conversations over at JetBrains?
That's a really good question. So let me start by saying that on Twitter or X nowadays, someone posted an image of some person opening a bottle of champagne and then saying, hey, this is JetBrains office right now. It was kind of like that. So of course, it's really nice to see that. Yeah, I mean, Visual Studio for Mac was not a bad IDE, but I think everyone could see it coming that the pace was really slow. So we thought when that announcement was made, okay, this is a perfect opportunity for Rider to get more attention and be in the spotlight and so on. So we actually did a quick, just after the announcement, I think we did a quick promo of one weekend where people could get Rider at a big discount. So I know really opportunistic, but also because of course, it's nice to have some new customers, right? But also because we felt, okay, people who are working on a Mac and so on, yes, they can use VS Code, but they could also use Rider, which is the exact same thing on Windows, on Mac OS and Linux, which comes with ReSharper embedded, and really provide a really good tool for anyone out there at that point. So the announcement was kind of nice in those terms. It's a bit sad to see it go, to be honest. It has a long legacy and a strong legacy from Mono and everything that came from Xamarin and so on. So it's kind of sad to see it go. Mono Develop, which was the precursor to Visual Studio for Mac, was a cool IDE back in the day. So in that terms, it's sad to see it go, but it's also for us, of course, a really good opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. Well, in developing Rider, ReSharper, and WebStorm, and all the other IDEs, those are essentially native, stateful Windows applications, or in this case, Mac applications. They're desktop applications. And so there's so many developers who have primarily over the last 10 years plus been doing nothing but web applications. And then they've gotten into maybe some stateful things with some of the SPA frameworks in the browser, that the code kind of living in the sandbox. But you mentioned earlier some of the eventing and data streams, that the development patterns that happen when you're developing the IDEs. Can you list off some essential patterns that you guys use, but that really any developer would benefit from using those if they are building desktop applications?
Yeah, I'll maybe start very, very low level. So for those of you who don't know, Rider and WebStorm and IntelliJ and so on, they all are built on top of IntelliJ Community, which is an open source project that you can actually clone if you want to build your own IDE. You can do that on top. A lot of features are in there, like Git, like a terminal, like a web client. Like there's a lot of things that are in there if you want to build your own IDE. I think Google did the same thing with Android Studio, for example. They are using the same core for their products.
Really?
What is nice about that thing is that very low level, IntelliJ IDEA Community has dependency injection in there, using a container that is probably, for people who have been long in .NET, very similar to the Unity container back in the day, where you would register in XML which components were mapped to which interfaces, etc. But the really cool thing with IntelliJ Community is that you can replace all of those components however you see fit. So, for example, in Rider, when you create a new project, that is actually done using a service that is the same across all of the IDEs, except the implementation of that interface is specific to one IDE. So we have IntelliJ, which will give you a Java project wizard. In Rider, you will see a .NET New Solution wizard. In WebStorm, you will see something where you can select Bootstrap and React and all of those things. So in patterns, I think that is a really nice one to actually have one really good foundation where you can just replace components as you see fit in your application. I'm not saying that every application should go overboard with DI, because not everyone is going to replace every single component in their application, of course. But for us, that thing really, really works well. And yeah, the other thing is, for example, message buses. That is one that we have as well, where when you change a file, for example, we get a notification in the IDE where anyone who is interested in that event can subscribe and do something with that information. So, for example, if the index for navigation has to be updated, you can subscribe to that, and the index can get updated. If you want to update UI in a tab, for example, you can do that. If you want to trigger a hot reload in JavaScript in the debugger, for example, the debugger can subscribe to that event as well and do something with it and change whatever is in the browser.
That's interesting. I think that has so many use cases, and I'm imagining even Maui applications that are on an iPhone kind of has the same dynamics. If there's even a menu item based on something selected or something have been copied into the clipboard or something happened, maybe a menu item becomes enabled or disabled. So I can see this message bus concept for passing around events as just widely available anytime you have a stateful UI of any kind. How is it implemented? I know it's hard to talk about code, just with your voice, but what does it generally look like? Is it .NET events? Is it observer pattern?
So in IntelliJ, that's all JVM based. So Rider, the front end, everything you see there is the JVM, Java and Kotlin language. But essentially what it is, that queue is a queue like you would have in .NET, where items get added and there's something reading from them. We do have a multiplexer in there so that the event can be distributed to multiple subscribers, etc. But it's not much more than that. Okay,
so it's an in-memory queue.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
A more interesting one that is also very relevant to Rider, but also to some tools like Code With Me, like our collaborative editing, is kind of an evolution of that thing. So Rider is JVM on the front end, so all of the UI is Java and JVM based. For .NET, we have ReSharper running in the background, which powers all of the smarts in C# language completion, navigation, etc. Now, at some point, we wanted to make sure that the front end and the back end could talk to one another, and you could do that with simple request response. That didn't really work too smoothly. You could do that with message buses, for example. Also didn't work too smoothly when we were building that. So we finally settled on a custom protocol that is kind of like an MVVM pattern that you would use in, for example, a mobile application where you have observable patterns and so on. except that our view model lives in a library that makes the communication across the wire and across processes possible. But it is essentially just MVVM there. But it's quite cool in the fact that the events can be subscribed to in multiple processes.
Nice. I want to ask you more about dependency injection, and you mentioning that you swap out different plugins. And I can understand that for an IDE, where if you have a general purpose IDE, you open a code file, maybe you have different panes that show you something about the code file that you're looking at, whatever type of code that is. But you mentioned for desktop applications using DI to swap out parts of the application. If I'm putting myself in a business application developer's position, I'm thinking, well, I kind of do have a main area and I do have side panes. Talk more about that. What kind of benefits could business developers leverage with that concept?
I think it really depends on what you're building. But I remember when I was a consultant, for example, at one of our customers, we had this general purpose business application that they were using. And we came up with the concept of having modules. So there was one for the help desk. There was one for the salespeople. There was one for pretty much everyone who had to do something with the business. And we came up with the idea of building a general purpose UI framework for that with some components and so on. Mm-hmm. And every team in the company could plug in their own parts of that application. So the folks building the help desk application, for example, they would not really swap out components, but they would essentially just add components to the container, and we would show them in the UI, hook everything up. We also had something in place where if something happened in the help desk application, for example, that it could potentially show something in a different module as well. And this was, by the way, before services and all became a thing. So this was really a desktop application and a database just. But it was interesting to make that possible because people felt that it was very rich and that the application was actually nice to develop for as well. So I think that might be something that a lot of business applications could also use.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so you've got a whole bunch of IDEs and desktop tools, and you got the ReSharper Visual Studio add-in, and then of course you've got TeamCity. What lessons have you learned about DevOps environments? Like, how do you make sure that all of this software stays working? You don't actually make changes, ship new bugs. How have you structured your own DevOps environments and suites of testing?
I will start with this whenever I open up our TeamCity server. So TeamCity is a CI server that we use internally as well as our, it's essentially the one we use to build any of our products, including TeamCity itself. And whenever I open it and I see the amount of agents that we have running at a given point in time and how big the queue of the builds that we have running, I'm always impressed. I think last time I checked, last week, we had something like 4,000 build agents running. And you would wonder, what are they all doing at any given point in time? Well, they are building and running tests and so on. So for example, for Rider, we have a massive test suite. I don't know by heart how many tests that we have. But essentially, whenever a developer is working on something, they work in a branch, they make their changes, they can build an installer if they want. So if they want to actually have a shippable version of their branch, they can trigger a build for that. But if not, we just run the regular test suite to see if everything compiles, etc. But also in a branch, we don't really want to bother developers with having to wait a long time for all of the tests and builds to run. Whenever someone merges their branch into the mainline, whenever they are ready to ship something, we have this concept called a safe merge, where your branch may have diverted from the main branch that we currently have. So what we do is on TeamCity, it will merge the main branch into the developers branch so that all of the latest changes in the ID are in that branch. And then we run the full suite of tests and builds that we have. So to give you an idea, we have tests for many .NET versions. We have tests for many operating systems. We have tests for all of those versions on all of the operating systems. So usually when you finish a feature and you are sure that you want to merge into main, it will take anything from 6 hours to 12 hours to sometimes 24, depending on what subsystems you've been working on before that actually goes into main, because the test suite is humongous. And yeah, it really runs on ARM machines. It runs on Windows. It runs on different versions of Linux, on Mac OS agents. So it's there's quite a bit involved there.
For sure.
But at the end, you get either hopefully a branch that is merged with a green build, and people actually get an installer that they can just run the dev or the nightly version on their machines. I'm not sure if anyone listening has tried JetBrains Toolbox. That is our application that allows you to do side-by-side installs of our tools or just get a new version, etc. We also hook into that one with our nightlies. So internally, we can do side-by-side of the stable version and, for example, the nightlies. And also the builds hook into that thing so that people can actually get in the morning a fresh version of the IDE they are building or working with.
Okay. So you mentioned a lot of tests. How do you think of the different types of tests? Because we talk about unit tests and then there's full system tests, but how do you categorize and chunk up different test suites and types?
We just call them tests usually because they are, some are probably considered better as unit tests, but essentially you're always going to do some form of integration. So for example, for the code inspections that we have, I think a lot of them could be considered unit tests because we essentially check whether some syntax is valid and what analysis triggers based on that source code. So that is probably more a unit test, but everything else is always going to be leaning towards an integration test in our cases. So let's say you want to run the same tests, checking syntax on multiple C# versions. We are at that point integrating with those C# versions and different .NET framework versions. So we have to look at the dependencies and so on to make that test pass. Personally, myself, I think there's value in everything. I really like unit tests, being able to do like the small test suites that run very quickly, give you good information about a certain part of the code, what it's doing. I also like integration tests to see what the application would behave like if there's all of the dependencies that you need. I have been a big fan of mocking and kind of having stubs or fakes of those dependencies in your code. However, recently I started to think differently about those. I still use them in my personal projects, for example. But I do think that if you are integrated with a system, unless you cover every edge case and you have deep knowledge about the service that you are mocking at some point, it's almost close to impossible to be able to test every single case that you can have. So, for example, if you would write an anti-framework test and use the in-memory database, yes, that's going to work. If all you want to test is if this data is there, can I get it from a repository or a service that you're building? That's going to work. But if you really want to test your system, what happens if there's a network involved, if there's all of those things involved, then I think you have to use something like an integration test.
Sure. As opposed to use mocking and have that as a reason for ignoring the integration tests.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Okay.
So there is room for all of those, and there's value in all of those, and I really think it is an old adage in IT. It depends, and I think for testing that also really holds true.
For sure. Okay, JetBrains has a few static analysis tools as well. There was inspect code, and I think there's been a few along the way. But what static analysis measures do you guys use now? What can we learn from what you've figured out?
Yeah, so every IDE essentially can also run headless. So we have inspect code that is essentially a headless resharper giving you all of the inspections that you would get in resharper or in Rider. We have the same thing for IntelliJ and so on. And we actually now also have a server-side product that runs those on your code base. What we typically look at is the things that are the typical errors that you will, or the strong warnings and errors that you would see in those tools. So we don't really look at, for example, formatting and things like that. I know a lot of people do that in their static analysis tools, make sure that the formatting and everything is correct. We have some of those, but we decided as a team, like, okay, what makes sense for our code base? What do we value in what we do there? So yeah, I have none off the top of my head, but for example, we disable a couple of the default ones that ship with ReSharper because for us, they don't make sense. We have a couple of others that we do enable because they do make sense. So yeah, it depends again.
Sure. Well, one of the challenges that has always been there, at least for the 20 years I've been paying attention to static analysis, is which rules do you make fail the build? And which rules may just be, oh, here's a warning, but we're not going to stop the build from going forward. And all of the different static analyzers come with different default rule sets. And some are more opinionated and others are like, here's the rules, but you're on your own for picking which ones you like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're in the same boat, essentially. We have our own defaults that we ship, and for most customers, they make sense. A lot of people do customize them, enable more, or change the severity of some issues. But generally, a lot of teams like the rules that we ship, and we like them as well. But there's definitely room for customizing that towards your own goals and your own needs. Customer I was working with recently, for example, they were very keen and very hard on making sure that they were also always using the latest language features and everything. So while if you use ReSharper, for example, you'll typically see that we have inspections saying, hey, you can use link here, or you can use var here, or maybe you want to change to primary constructors if you're on the latest C# version, things like that. They had those as errors. So if developers had something where they could use one of the new features, the build would fail. I'm not saying that is something that everyone should do, but if your team does value being on the latest version and making sure that those things are always in place, that is a good customization, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, wow. There was one, I think you guys deprecated it. I could be misspeaking. It was a duplicate code identifier. Does that ring a bell at all?
Yeah. Yep.
Or is
exactly.
that still in one of the tools somewhere?
A couple of people were using it, and we actually got comments from some people like, why are you shutting this down? But it was close to impossible to maintain with all of the .NET versions, all of the different syntax trees that exist and so on. Like duplicates, if it's exactly the same, if you look at the text of the source codes, it's kind of easy to discover. But should you also trigger, for example, when you have a regular C# class and you have a class that uses primary constructors, that is semantically the same, but maybe not actually the same in source code. So many edge cases to cover and so many things to compare that we thought, okay, given the amount of people using this one, it kind of makes sense to stop adding new features to this one.
Does anybody else have a duplicate identifier tool that you're aware of or that you guys use for yourselves?
The duplicate code finder that we had still works, but not on recent C# versions.
Yeah.
But it will trigger, like, for example, if you have an if statement that is reused across multiple classes and so on, if that is exactly the same code, it will still trigger and will still work. Last time I checked, there was one tool that I found for C#, but that also seemed like it was no longer very recent and supporting all of the latest C# features. So no idea what's happening in that space, to be honest.
Well, I used your duplicate code finder, the old version that was last put out. Every time as a consultant, I'm handed code bases that, I'm seeing for the first time. They're large. Somebody else built them over 10, 20 years. And it's really informative to be able to have that in the toolbox and run it against a code base that I have no familiarity with and just be able to see what percentage it appears that copy paste development was used. Not just is maybe a certain type of constructor semantically the same, but no, literally entire blocks of code exists verbatim, in 7 different places throughout the code base. Because anytime someone goes into a brand new code base, even if you're joining a new team, you kind of need to get a sense of what kind of code base, what level of quality, what level of coding practices. And that tends to be one of them, just duplicated code.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I believe Independent by Patrick Smackia. I think that is one that still has duplicate codes detection.
That's right. Yeah, Patrick has been on the show, Independent. Yeah, that's a very deep and powerful analyzer tool.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't really trigger while you are writing code, but it's super helpful. Like you say, when you end up with a different team and different code bases and so on, it's super helpful to get a little bit of a feel for how the application was built.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, you guys have a presence everywhere, it seems. Is there a presence in and around VS Code as well? Or how do y'all work with that?
So we don't have a presence in VS Code. So obviously we look at that thing. But I think apart from Space and maybe TeamCity, we don't really do much with VS Code. A reason for that is, of course, we have our own IDEs, but also because the extensibility model is yet completely different from what Visual Studio on Windows does, for example, the full-blown Visual Studio. So we decided when we were building Rider, VS Code also came about. And we thought, okay, we have our own IDE. We know all of the integration points. If there's anything that we cannot really integrate with, we can just change it because we own everything. And we decided VS Code was not worth that effort because it would require quite some customizations to make all of the, for example, resharper features work in Visual Studio Code.
Yeah. There seems to be a pretty big segmentation between people who use VS Code most of the day for development and for people who use Visual Studio or Rider most of the day for development, because they are different. I use Visual Studio with ReSharper the most, and then I find myself for text editing or even editing Markdown, I'll pull that up in VS Code. They definitely have the niche where the different tools excel. Well, we're kind of the end of our time here. Are there any interesting things that people who use various JetBrains tools should look out for in the coming maybe .NET 8 release or beyond that you guys are working on?
Yeah, .NET 8 is definitely going to be interesting. So usually I hear this from a lot of customers and our user base, that when a new C# version comes out, they use ReSharper Rider to learn it because we have those inspections giving you all of the hints on, hey, you could change this to whatever new language feature is there.
Yeah.
So that's definitely going to be there with .NET 8 and the next Rider 2023.3. Some of the ones that I'm really looking forward to is all of the entity framework inspections that we're also adding. So we've been adding a couple over recent versions where, for example, if you have a database and you want to load navigational properties, we actually give you hints when you forget some includes, for example, in entity framework. But we're adding more and more inspections in that realm. So one of the ones that I'm really looking forward to is one where if in your entity framework query, you use something that requires the entity framework query to run in memory instead of on the database, ReSharper and Rider will actually tell you, hey, this is not something that the database can handle. Maybe you want to do this differently.
Nice.
So that is one that I'm really, really looking forward to.
Yeah, because that creates all kinds of select n+1 problems where you just pull the whole record set back and then evaluating expressions. Yeah, it's not so much that we're running things locally. It's that the query generated pulls back way more data than necessary so that the in-memory expression can happen.
Yeah, exactly. Also related to that, I actually forgot this is the most exciting for me because I really love application performance, but I do know that a lot of people only grab their profiler whenever something is really broken or they really suspect that something is going on. Both in Rider and ReSharper, we have DPA, Dynamic Program Analysis, which is essentially a profiler that runs continuously. It's not a full-blown profiler, but it will catch a couple of things. Like, for example, with Entity Framework, if you don't look at the inspection in the IDE, DPA will still catch the fact that you are bringing back 100,000 rows, for example, where you shouldn't. But we're also adding things there that look at actions or minimal APIs and so on, that if those methods are slow, it will actually highlight those and say, hey, maybe it is time to look in the profiler at what is going on there.
Nice. We didn't even touch on the memory profiler or the performance profiler. Your tool belt is so deep. All right. Well, Maarten, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing us your perspective on developer tools. I think statistically, most of the developers out there in the industry are working on business applications with non-technical users, but you guys work on applications who are used by developers, which is a very interesting space. So thanks for sharing us that perspective.
You're welcome. And again, thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure indeed. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.